work. Take her out on a date.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me.
I could be anybody I want.
Welcome to Screen Recaps, and today we are going to recapping the movie The Cobbler. In 1903, the setting is New York City, where a rabbi visits a cobbler shop to discuss the problems of the Jewish community. The cobbler receives the shoes of a troublesome man and repairs them on his stitching machine, while his son listens to the story of how the machine was acquired by his grandfather. Fast forward to present day, Max owns a shoe repair shop and observes Tarine and Emiliano outside. The owner of the barber shop next door joins him and inquires about his love life and mother. Carmen enters the shop and seeks support from local businesses against developers trying to force out residents. Max considers selling, but Carmen inspires him with a speech about the importance of his shop in the city. Max is given a leaflet by Carmen, who asks him to join a protest supporting an old man named Mr. Solomon, who is facing eviction from his home. After work, Max heads home to cook dinner for his elderly mother, Sarah. The next day, a man named Leon visits the shop and Max admires his collection of watches. Leon leaves some shoes for Max to repair and promises to return at 6 p.m. to collect them. While repairing the shoes, Max's stitching machine breaks, so he goes to the basement to find an old machine to complete the job. Max tries them on and sees Leon's face staring back at him in the mirror. He quickly removes the shoes and returns to normal. Max attempts the same trick with other shoes, but nothing happens. He then goes back to the basement and uses the old machine to stitch another pair of shoes. As soon as he puts on the shoes and looks at himself in the mirror, his appearance changes once again. He experiments with different shoes, taking on the appearance of various people, including a deceased man and a transvestite named Marcia. The next day, he returns a pair of shoes to a news reporter named Danny Donald, who gives him his business card. Max decides to test out his newfound ability and goes to Jimmy's shop, where he goes unrecognized. He wears the shoes of an Asian man and spends time in Chinatown. He dines at an expensive restaurant, changes shoes in the bathroom, and leaves without paying. He steals shoes from a man with a fancy car and then retrieves his own car from the valet. When he gets home that night, Sarah asks him about his day. He asks her what she would do if she could do anything she wanted, and she says she would have dinner with his father, Abraham, who left them years ago. Max goes to the closet and takes some of his father's shoes. The next day, Taryn comes into the shop with Emiliano's shoes for repair. Max uses the stitching machine and pretends to be her boyfriend. He frequents a bar in hopes of meeting women, but when he brings one home and admits he still lives with his mother, she immediately leaves him. Spotting Emiliano outside his apartment, Max quickly takes off his shoes. As Emiliano leaves, Max rings the doorbell and Tarine invites him in, but when she suggests they shower together, he declines and leaves in a hurry, realizing he would have to remove his shoes. Meanwhile, Sarah watches a news report featuring Carmen and Mr. Solomon protesting on TV, hosted by Danny. The next day, Max unexpectedly runs into Carmen on the street, and she urges him to get involved once again. Later, he disguises himself as a child and secretly observes her in her office. After repairing his father's shoes, he puts them on and admires himself in the mirror. That night, Sarah is dressed up for dinner when Max enters the room disguised as Abraham and spends the evening with her. He says goodbye to his father's reflection, tucks Sarah into bed, and returns the shoes to the wardrobe. The next day, Max learns of his mother's passing, and at the funeral, Jimmy assures him that he was a devoted son. Leon finally returns to the shop to collect his shoes. Leon displays no empathy towards Max's recent loss of his mother when asked for the ticket. He confesses to losing it and warns Max to find his shoes before tomorrow or face the consequences. Max tails Leon in disguise and witnesses him threatening some men in a shop before returning to his apartment. Max waits outside until Leon leaves, then disguises himself as Leon and knocks on the door. Leon's girlfriend, Macy, answers and reveals that Leon had hit her, causing her to leave. Max takes advantage of the situation and searches the apartment, discovering a bag filled with guns and weapons. However, he accidentally tases himself and passes out. Upon waking up, he finds himself face to face with the real Leon, who tries to strangle him. Max uses the taser to knock Leon out and ties him up. When Leon regains consciousness, Max disguises himself as a child and demands to know where the watches are. When Leon refuses to talk, Max leaves the room and returns dressed as a Marcia, wearing red stiletto heels in size 10.5. Leon is visibly anxious and discloses the location of the watches to Marcia. Max locates them and stashes them in his bag. Suddenly, there's a knock on the door. Leon claims it's his associates, and they're coming to collect $50,000. Max leaves Leon tied up and assumes his identity. They bring Max to a building where a man named Rat is being attacked. Max intervenes, making Rat apologize and instructing the boys to release him. They continue on to Mr. Greenwald's house, where Max hands him money and assures him of the remainder upon completion. Disguised as Marcia, Max returns to Leon's apartment, only to find him escaped and pointing a gun. Leon strikes Marcia and attempts to strangle him, but Marcia kicks off a shoe, causing Leon to recoil. Marcia then transforms into Max and continues the struggle, ultimately stabbing Leon in the neck with the shoe. Leon falls to the ground lifeless, while Max flees the scene and returns home. The next day, Max decides to report the murder to the police, but they are skeptical of his story, especially after finding no evidence of a crime at Leon's apartment. Despite Max's insistence, the police refuse to investigate further and leave. Later, Max discovers the bag containing the incriminating items at his shop and confides in Jimmy about his plan to return the money. However, Jimmy reveals that Max's father had a similar experience before disappearing and warns him of the danger he may be in. Max is furious that Jimmy kept this information from him, but ultimately decides to return the money to Mrs. Greenwald under the guise of a different identity. However, this plan backfires when one of Mrs. Greenwald's assistants attacks Marcia. Max wakes up in the car, overhearing Brian and Jeffrey's plan to burn down the building. He swaps shoes with a dead man to disguise himself, startling Brian and Jeffrey and causing them to crash. Max escapes unharmed. Max discovers a leaflet about Mr. Solomon's eviction and tells Carmen about Mrs. Greenwald's plot. They decide to warn Mr. Solomon, but he refuses to sell despite the danger. Max borrows Mr. Solomon's shoes and offers Mrs. Greenwald $100,000 and a bus ticket to Chicago. Surprisingly, she agrees and promises to arrange his journey. Brian and Jeffrey go to Mr. Solomon's apartment, where they are asked to remove their shoes. Max steals their shoes and alters them. Max disguises himself as Leon and sneaks into the apartment building. Jeffrey follows him and finds Max pretending to be Brian. Max distracts Jeffrey and incapacitates him. Max contacts Mrs. Greenwald and arranges a meeting. Mrs. Greenwald verifies with Brian, but he has been apprehended. Mrs. Greenwald encounters Carmen and goes back to the apartment. Max, disguised as Mr. Solomon, waits for her. Max reveals that Brian had been lying and Mrs. Greenwald threatens him. Danny Donald enters with a camera crew. The next morning, Taryn arrives for Emiliano's shoes. Carmen asks Max about his accomplishment, but he doesn't say anything. She invites him to dinner on Friday, and they exchange contact information. Max, disguised as Leon, gives Macy Leon's watches to sell. Ratprick stops Max and forces him into a car with a gun, seeking revenge. They make fun of Max before a car crash. Max wakes up at Jimmy's store, where Jimmy reveals he saved him and got rid of Leon's body. Jimmy transforms into Abraham, and they embrace. But Max is angry that his father kept this secret. Abraham explains it was for their safety. They go to the basement where Abraham shows a room full of shoes that help others. They can't leave through the front, so they use a chauffeur-driven limousine. Abraham tells Max about the vagrant and their family's stitching machine.
I thought I was doing